31 years ago, an entire ballet team mysteriously vanished with their coach, leaving authorities puzzled and parents grieving. Public speculation immediately focused on the male ballet coach, with most assuming the worst about what he had done to the girls. But one day, 3 decades later, one father noticed a crucial detail about his daughter's ballet shoes. This single observation would change the entire case and reveal the truth, something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room of Rick Holloway's modest suburban home. At 60 years old, Rick's face bore the lines of a man who had weathered life's storms, yet there was a softness in his eyes as he watched his 5-year-old niece Tasha play on the worn carpet. Rick sat in his favorite armchair, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Across from him, his younger brother Daniel, 10 years his junior, leaned back on the sofa, his own mug cradled between his palms. The brothers had been talking for hours, their conversation meandering through memories and current events, carefully skirting the subject that hung heavy in the air: the absence of Rick's daughter, Claire, who had been missing for 31 years. The visit had become something of a weekend ritual since Rick's wife passed away from cancer 7 years ago. The house, once filled with the laughter of family, now stood as a silent testament to loss. Daniel and Tasha's visits brought a welcome respite from the loneliness that often threatened to overwhelm Rick. As the brothers' conversation settled into a comfortable silence, Tasha's excited voice suddenly broke through. "Daddy, look at these ballet shoes Uncle Rick has. They're so pretty." Rick and Daniel paused, confusion etching their features as they turned to see Tasha standing before a glass cabinet they had almost forgotten existed. The cabinet, tucked away in a corner of the living room, held memories too painful for Rick to face on a daily basis. Daniel rose from his seat, crossing the room to where his daughter stood, her small hands pressed against the glass. "Look, Daddy," Tasha said, her voice brimming with excitement. "These shoes look like the size of my ballet shoes at home. Can I try these?" As Daniel reached Tasha's side, Rick joined them, his heart constricting at the sight of the delicate pink ballet slippers nestled in the cabinet. They were Claire's, preserved like a time capsule from the day she disappeared. The sight of them brought a flood of memories: Claire's first ballet recital, her determined practice sessions in the living room, the pride in her eyes when she mastered a new move. Daniel, sensing the weight of the moment, gently told Tasha, "I don't know, darling. Those shoes look like they might be a size too small for you." His voice was soft, careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. Curiosity sparked in Tasha's eyes as she asked, "But who do they belong to?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Rick, unsure how to navigate this delicate subject. Rick nodded, a silent permission granted. "It's all right," he said softly, reaching for the cabinet door. With careful hands, Rick removed the shoes from their resting place. The leather was still soft, the ribbons slightly faded but intact. He knelt beside Tasha, helping her slip one shoe onto her foot. As Daniel had guessed, it was indeed too small, but Tasha's eyes lit up at the feel of the satin against her skin. Tasha's brow furrowed as she looked up at her uncle. "Why do you have ballet shoes here, Uncle Rick?" Her gaze drifted back to the cabinet, settling on a photograph she hadn't noticed before. "Who's this girl?" she asked, pointing to the image of a smiling child with Rick's eyes. Daniel and Rick exchanged a look, a lifetime of unspoken grief passing between them. Rick took a deep breath, realizing that the time had come to share a part of his past he had long kept hidden. "It's okay," he said, more to himself than to Daniel. She would find out eventually. Daniel knelt beside his daughter, his voice gentle as he began to explain. "You see, Tasha, ballet has always been a part of our family. It's almost like a tradition." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Uncle Rick used to have a little girl about your age a long time ago, but she went missing." Tasha's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Missing? How, Dad?" Noticing Daniel's hesitation, Rick stepped forward, lowering himself onto the floor beside Tasha with slow, measured movements. He pointed to the girl in the blue tutu at the center of the lineup, his voice calm but weighted with emotion. "Her name was Claire," he said quietly. "She was just 4 years old when someone took her. A bad person. I don't know who, but it happened a long time ago." They all stared at the photograph, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. After a moment, Tasha spoke up, her voice small but clear. "She looked so pretty, Uncle Rick. She looks like you." Rick smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. "Thank you, Tasha." Noticing the sadness that had settled over Rick, Daniel gently guided Tasha away from the cabinet. "Why don't we put the shoes back now, sweetheart?" he suggested, closing the cabinet door with a soft click. Turning to Rick, Daniel asked, "Everything all right?" Rick shook his head as if to clear away the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a long, long time ago." As they moved away from the cabinet, the weight of the past seemed to linger in the air, a reminder of the wounds that time had yet to heal fully. Rick found himself caught between the warmth of the present moment and the ache of what had been lost, a familiar struggle that he had learned to live with over the years. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Rick's eyes remained fixed on the cabinet, lost in memories of a time that seemed both impossibly distant and achingly close. The tension in the room was palpable, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Rick, seeking a moment to compose himself, slowly rose to his feet. "I think I'll make us some drinks," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Daniel, gin and tonic?" Daniel nodded, grateful for the momentary distraction. "Sounds good, Rick." "Thanks." Rick made his way to the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The familiar routine of preparing drinks provided a welcome respite from the flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm him. He reached for 2 glasses, the crystal cool against his fingers. The act of measuring the gin, squeezing fresh lime, and adding the tonic water was almost meditative, allowing him a moment to steady his nerves. As he pressed the lime juice into the glasses, Rick could hear Tasha's animated chatter from the living room. Her innocence and enthusiasm were a stark contrast to the heaviness that had settled over him. He took a deep breath, forcing a smile as he returned to the living room, drinks in hand. "Here you go," Rick said, handing a glass to Daniel. Just as he was about to sit down, Tasha piped up again. "Can we watch ballet?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "My favorite dance team is performing today in a show. I think it already started, but we can restart it on the TV." Daniel hesitated, sensing that now might not be the best time for such a request. "We can watch it later at home, sweetie," he began, but Rick interrupted him. "It's okay, Tasha," Rick said, his voice softer than usual. "Turn on the TV. It's too quiet in here anyway." He gave Daniel a reassuring nod as Tasha eagerly reached for the remote at the coffee table and passed it to Rick. As Rick navigated to the online show, Tasha's excitement filled the room. She twirled and leaped in the open space of the living room, mimicking the movements of the dancers on screen. Rick and Daniel watched her, sipping their drinks in companionable silence. "You must be very happy," Rick said to his brother, his eyes never leaving Tasha's joyful dance. "She's a sweet child and talented too." Daniel nodded, a hint of wistfulness in his voice. "We tried for 10 years before we had her. Sarah and I, we almost gave up hope. But then 5 years ago our little miracle arrived." Rick reached out, patting Daniel's arm. "You're a lucky man, Dan. You have a lovely family." Daniel raised his glass in a small toast. "You're my family too, Rick. You have us." As Tasha's favorite team finished their performance, the program announced a special guest appearance. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a treat for you. Please welcome the Étoile Ensemble from the Marlupi Ballet Conservatory, performing today for the Children of the World charity." Tasha's excitement reached new heights as the professional dancers took the stage. Rick found himself drawn into the performance, admiring the grace and skill of the dancers. But as the camera panned across the line of 6 women in their opening pose, Something caught his eye. He leaned forward, his drink forgotten in his hand. There on one of the dancers' shoes was a small bow. It was such a tiny detail, but it sent a jolt through Rick's body. He grabbed the remote, rewinding the footage to the close-up of the dancers. Now he saw it clearly. One woman, and only one, wore shoes with a delicate bow on top. The sight transported Rick back 3 decades, to mornings spent tying those same bows on tiny ballet slippers. His heart began to race, a mix of hope and disbelief washing over him. Daniel returned from a quick trip to the bathroom, noticing Rick's intense focus on the screen. "What's going on?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paused the video, rose from his seat, and walked to the glass cabinet, his movements almost mechanical. With trembling hands, he retrieved Claire's ballet shoes once more. "Dan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." He held up Claire's shoe next to the frozen image on the TV screen. Claire always wore bows on her ballet shoes. It wasn't common. It can actually make dancing a bit harder. But she insisted. She said it made her feel like a princess. Daniel looked from the shoe to the screen and back again, uncertainty written across his face. "Rick, what are you saying? Do you think that's Claire? Anyone could wear bows on their shoes. I think you just want to believe it could be her, but, I mean, what are the chances?" Rick stared at the woman's face on the screen, trying to see past the stage makeup and the years that had passed. 31 years is a long time, Dan. I can't be 100% sure, but they have the same hair color. And those bows, this is a professional dance group. They never wear bows on their shoes. See for yourself. Look at all the other teams on the show. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Why are you bringing this up now? Did you put extra gin in that tonic?" No, Rick insisted, his eyes never leaving the screen. "I know how this sounds, believe me, but I can't ignore it." Tasha, sensing the change in mood, looked up at them with worried eyes. "Can we keep watching?" she asked timidly. Rick nodded, pressing play once more. But as the performance continued, his eyes remained fixed on the dancer with the bow-adorned shoes, his mind racing with possibilities he had long ago forced himself to abandon. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the music from the TV and Tasha's occasional gasps of delight at particularly impressive dance moves. As the performance drew to a close, Rick found himself holding his breath, waiting for any additional information about the dancers. His patience was rewarded when the names of the performers began to scroll across the bottom of the screen. Rick's eyes scanned the names frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. When he saw it, he felt as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Celeste Kendrick, the screen read, age 35. He turned to Daniel, his voice urgent but low, not wanting to alarm Tasha. "Dan, look, the age fits. Claire would be 35 now. It all adds up." Daniel leaned in, studying the information on the screen. His skepticism was beginning to waver in the face of Rick's certainty. "I suppose there is a small possibility," he conceded, his voice barely above a whisper. Unable to sit still any longer, Rick settled on the couch and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he searched for information about the Étoile Ensemble and the Marlupi Ballet Conservatory. The room was quiet save for the soft tapping of Rick's fingers on his phone and the low volumes of the TV where the ballet performance had begun. "Dan, come look at this," Rick called, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. Daniel joined him on the couch, peering at the phone screen. "It says here that the Étoile Ensemble is an exclusive ballet group associated with a traditional, wealthy family, the Kendrick legacy," Rick explained, scrolling through the article. His eyes darted back and forth, absorbing every detail. "They're known for their reclusive nature and selective performances. This charity event, it's the first time they've performed publicly in years." Daniel's brow furrowed as he read over Rick's shoulder. "Rick, I know what you're thinking, but these are powerful people. You can't just make accusations without proof." Rick stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. His mind was racing, years of dormant hope suddenly bursting to life. "I need to know more, Dan. I can't just sit here and do nothing, not when there's even the slightest chance." He trailed off, his eyes landing on the glass cabinet where Claire's shoes had been returned. The sight of them seemed to solidify his resolve. "I'm going to the police station," he announced, grabbing his car keys from the hook by the front door. Daniel rose, alarm evident in his voice. "Rick, wait. Think about this. The police won't share anything with you, you know that." But Rick was already halfway out the door. He turned back briefly, addressing both Daniel and Tasha. "I'll only be gone for a while. Feel free to grab anything you need. Don't wait up for me." As the door closed behind Rick, Daniel and Tasha exchanged worried glances. The peaceful afternoon had taken an unexpected turn, leaving them both unsure of what would happen next. Daniel sank back onto the couch, pulling Tasha close to him. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, more to reassure himself than his daughter. "Uncle Rick just needs to check on something important." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the driveway as Rick climbed into his car. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out onto the street, his mind focused on a single goal: finding the truth about the dancer with the bow on her shoes. The drive to the police station was short, but to Rick it felt like an eternity. Each traffic light seemed to linger on red. Each car in front of him moved at a maddeningly slow pace. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The familiar streets of his neighborhood blurred past as his mind raced with possibilities and questions. As he pulled into the parking lot of the police station, Rick took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. The building loomed before him, a place he had visited countless times over the past 3 decades, always hoping for news, always leaving disappointed. But this time felt different. This time, he had something tangible, a lead that might finally bring him answers. Rick stepped out of his car, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the warmth of hope burning in his chest. He made his way to the entrance, each step feeling both hesitant and determined. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the familiar interior of the station. At the front desk, a face he recognized greeted him. Officer Jones looked up from his computer, a flicker of recognition and then resignation crossing his features. "Mr. Holloway," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "what can I do for you today?" Rick approached the desk, his hands resting on the cool surface. "Officer Jones," he began, his voice low and urgent, "I need to know if there's been any new information, any leads at all about Claire's disappearance." Officer Jones sighed, a sound Rick had heard too many times over the years. The officer turned to his computer, his fingers clacking against the keyboard as he pulled up the file, a file that had remained unchanged for far too long. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holloway, there's nothing new. The case is still cold." Rick's fists clenched at his sides, frustration and disappointment warring with the hope that had brought him here. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I saw something today," he said, leaning in closer. "On TV, a ballet performance. There was a dancer. She looked like Claire. She had the same hair and her shoes. They had bows on them, just like Claire always wore." Officer Jones leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of sympathy and skepticism. "Mr. Holloway, I understand you want to believe it's her, but—" "Her name is Celeste Kendrick," Rick interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Can you look her up?" "Please." The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching Rick's face. Finally, he turned back to his computer. Rick watched anxiously as Officer Jones typed in the name, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard throughout the quiet station. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Jones looked up. "I found a Celeste Kendrick in the system. She's a ballet dancer, but Mr. Holloway—" He paused, his voice softening. "Her profile doesn't match Claire's. The age is the same, but the birth date, birthplace, everything else is different. Are you sure she looks similar to your daughter?" Rick shook his head vehemently, unwilling to accept this setback. "It's hard to tell after so many years, but the shoes, the bows on the shoes, that has to mean something." Officer Jones rubbed his temples. When he spoke, his voice was slow and empathetic. "Mr. Holloway, I know you want to believe it's Claire. I would have liked that too. but from where I'm sitting, it looks like you might be imagining connections that aren't there." The officer leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Have you considered getting some professional help? Therapy, maybe? I've suggested it before, I know, but you were in the army. Not being able to protect your girl, to do anything to get her back, that must have broken you. And then losing your wife to cancer 7 years ago, it's a lot for anyone to bear." Rick felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. "I might be a veteran, but I'm not delusional," he snapped, his voice echoing in the quiet station. "I'm not just imagining things. If you won't help me, I'll find out for myself." Officer Jones stood up, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Holloway, I have to advise against that. Please, think about what you're saying." But Rick had already turned his back, striding towards the exit. As he pushed through the doors, he heard Officer Jones calling after him, but the words were lost in the rush of blood in his ears. Outside, Rick paced down the stairs, his mind whirling. He approached his car, parked haphazardly in his haste to get inside. An officer standing nearby eyed the parking job with disapproval. "Sir, you can't park like this," the officer said, his tone stern. Rick, already on edge, struggled to keep his voice level. "I'm sorry, officer. I was in a rush." The officer's expression softened slightly as he recognized Rick. "I'll let it slide this time, Mr. Holloway. But please, be careful on the road." Rick barely managed a nod in response as he climbed into his car. As he started the engine, he knew one thing for certain. If the police wouldn't help him, he would have to take matters into his own hands. With shaking hands, he pulled up the video of the ballet performance once more. There, in the description, he found what he was looking for: the name of the venue, Kendrick Grand Theatre. A quick online search revealed that the theatre wasn't far, just in the next neighborhood over. Without a second thought, Rick put the car in drive and set off towards his new destination, leaving the station behind him. As he drove, his mind raced with possibilities. What would he do when he got there? What did he hope to find? He had no concrete plan, just an overwhelming need to see the girl, to see Celeste, up close, to confirm with his own eyes what his heart already believed to be true. Rick's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The blazing summer sun streamed through the windshield, casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow across his face, highlighting the determination etched in his features. His mind raced, replaying the conversation with Officer Jones over and over. The frustration and disappointment that had become all too familiar over the past 3 decades burned in his chest, but this time it was mixed with a fierce determination. The drive took about 30 minutes, each passing minute increasing Rick's anxiety and anticipation. The streets became more upscale, lined with manicured lawns and imposing houses. Finally, he saw it. The Kendrick Grand Theatre, its facade gleaming under the bright midday sun, its grand architecture standing out against the clear blue sky. As he pulled into the theatre's parking lot, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He parked his car and sat there for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts and calm his nerves. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars that he assumed belonged to staff or other performers. Rick stepped out of the car, the midday air humid against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the vehicle. He made his way toward the imposing theatre building, each step carrying a mix of hesitation and determination. As he approached the entrance, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Fishing it out, he saw Daniel's name flashing on the screen. Only then did he notice several missed calls from his brother. Had he really been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't heard them? With a deep breath, Rick answered the call. "Hello?" Daniel's worried voice came through clearly. "Rick? Where are you? Are you still at the police station? I've been trying to reach you." Rick felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, Dan. My phone was with me the whole time, but I guess I didn't notice it ringing." He paused, unsure how much to reveal. I'm at the Kendrick Grand Theatre. The police wouldn't help, so I decided to check this place out myself." He could almost hear Daniel's frown through the phone. "Rick, please, just come home. This isn't a good idea." But Rick's resolve was firm. "I can't, Dan. I'm pretty much sure it's her. I'm here now, so I might as well try to find out something. Maybe I can ask around, get some information about her or the ballet company." Daniel sighed heavily. "I know nothing I say will stop you. If you really think this is necessary, then I'll come too. I won't leave you alone in this. Let me drop Tasha off with Sarah, and I'll meet you there." As Rick was about to respond, movement near the theater entrance caught his eye. A group of ballet dancers, still in their performance attire, was exiting the building and heading towards a sleek black limousine. Among them, he spotted her, the woman he believed to be Claire. "Dan, I've got to go," Rick said hurriedly, ending the call without waiting for a response. He started running towards the group, his heart racing. But he was too late. By the time he got there near the car, the door had closed, and the limousine pulled away from the curb. Without hesitation, Rick sprinted back to his car. He couldn't lose them now, not when he was so close. As he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, he could see the limousine in the distance. He sent a quick voice message to Daniel, explaining the situation and apologizing for the abrupt end to their call. The drive took them through winding streets and into an exclusive, wealthy neighborhood. Rick maintained a safe distance, not wanting to arouse suspicion. The houses here were more like mansions, set far back from the road behind high walls and ornate gates. Finally, the limousine turned into a private driveway, disappearing behind large iron gates. Rick slowed down, pulling over a few meters from the entrance. He quickly texted Daniel the address, adding that this must be one of the Kendrick properties. Then, taking a deep breath to steady himself, he got out of the car and approached the imposing gates. As the afternoon wore on, the stillness of the area was interrupted only by the distant hum of passing cars and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Rick stood before the gates, his heart pounding, knowing that beyond them lay the answers he had been seeking for over 3 decades. With a trembling hand, he reached out and pressed the intercom button, the sharp buzz piercing the quiet. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as he stood before the ornate iron gates. The sprawling estate beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, a testament to the wealth and power of the Kendrick family. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, giving the scene an almost surreal quality. For a moment he hesitated, the enormity of what he was about to do weighing heavily on him. But the image of Claire, or Celeste, drove him forward. With a trembling hand he pressed the intercom button again. There was a brief crackle of static before a crisp, professional voice responded, "Kendrick residence. How may I assist you?" Rick swallowed hard, his mind racing to formulate a plausible explanation for his presence. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm the photographer for the ballet team. For the news articles about today's performance, I was hoping to get a few more shots." There was a pause, and Rick held his breath, certain that his lie would be discovered. But then, to his surprise, the gates began to open with a soft, mechanical hum. "Please proceed to the main house," the voice instructed. Rick stepped through, his footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, as he made his way towards the imposing mansion. The grounds were immaculate, with perfectly manicured lawns and artfully arranged flower beds. The warm afternoon light bathed everything in a golden glow, a stark contrast to the tension Rick felt building inside him. As he approached the front door, it swung open, revealing a neatly dressed maid. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Rick, clearly not expecting a visitor at this hour. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "You're the photographer." Rick nodded, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. "Yes, that's right. I hope it's not too late. We missed a few shots at the performance, and I was hoping to complete the set here." The maid's brow furrowed in confusion, but after a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside. "Please, come in. Wait here in the foyer. I'll inform Mr. Kendrick of your arrival." As the maid disappeared deeper into the house, Rick found himself alone in the grand entrance hall. The opulence of his surroundings was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light mingling with the warm afternoon sun streaming through tall windows. Priceless artwork adorned the walls, and antique furniture was artfully arranged throughout the space. But it was the sound of laughter and excited chatter that caught his attention. The voices of the ballet dancers drifted through the air, a melody of happiness and camaraderie. Rick's heart clenched at the sound. If one of these women was truly Claire, she had been living here all these years, surrounded by luxury and apparent joy. A small part of him felt relief that she hadn't suffered, hadn't been abandoned or worse. But the larger part of him couldn't reconcile this life with the little girl he had lost so long ago. As the voices grew quieter, Rick heard the maid speaking to someone, explaining his presence. Then came the sound of approaching footsteps. Rick straightened, steeling himself for what was to come. Reuben Kendrick, the man Rick had read about in the article during his research on the ballet company, rounded the corner with the ballet team, following closely behind. Tall and distinguished, he appeared to be in his early 60s, his silver hair and impeccably tailored suit exuding wealth and influence. With a practiced smile, he extended his hand to Rick. "Reuben Kendrick," he introduced himself smoothly. "I wasn't expecting a photographer from a news station at this hour. Which outlet did you say you were from?" Rick's mind raced, grasping for the name he had seen earlier from the online channel where he watched the ballet at home this morning. "HCN-TV," he blurted out, hoping his nervousness wasn't obvious. We missed a couple of shots at the theater. We were hoping it would be all right to take a few more pictures here." Reuben considered for a moment, his eyes scanning Rick's face. Finally, he nodded. "I suppose that would be fine. Where would you like to set up? And where's your equipment?" Rick's gaze darted from Reuben to the group of dancers that lined up behind him. His eyes were drawn immediately to the woman wearing the shoes with the distinctive bows. She looked back at him with polite curiosity. No hint of recognition in her eyes, the sight of her so close yet so distant made Rick's heart ache. For a moment Rick froze, overwhelmed by the situation. Then, gathering himself, he said, I seem to have left my camera equipment in the car. If you'll excuse me, I'll just go fetch it quickly." He turned towards the door, his heart racing. But as his hand reached for the doorknob, Reuben's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stop!" Rick froze, his hand still outstretched. He heard Reuben bark an order to his security personnel, and suddenly, two men in black suits were flanking him, their hands firmly grasping his arms. The atmosphere in the foyer shifted dramatically, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Reuben Kendrick's face had transformed from polite curiosity to cold suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he studied Rick. "Get the ballet team to their rooms," Reuben ordered the maid, his tone clipped and authoritative. Rick watched helplessly as the women were ushered away, their expressions flickering between confusion and worry. His gaze locked onto one dancer in particular, the woman he believed to be Claire. His breath caught as he searched her face, desperate for any sign of recognition. But there was none. She walked past him without so much as a second glance, swallowed into the grandeur of the mansion. The heavy doors shut behind the last dancer, sealing Rick's hope along with them. A slow, deliberate silence followed before Reuben turned back to him, his face unreadable. The stillness in the air was unnerving, broken only by the distant ticking of an antique clock. "I know the owner of HCN-TV personally," Reuben said at last, his voice dangerously calm. He took a measured step forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the gleaming marble floors. "We had a specific photographer at today's event, one I personally requested." His gaze bore into Rick, sharp and assessing. If there were any missing shots, he would have been sent here, not you. Rick felt a chill creep up his spine, but he held his ground. "So I'll ask you once," Reuben continued, his voice dropping lower. "Who are you really?" The weight of the moment pressed down on Rick, the truth teetering on the edge of his tongue. His mind raced, grasping for a way out. But he knew. There was none. He had been caught. His hastily constructed lie had crumbled, leaving him exposed. And yet, beneath the fear tightening his chest, something stronger took hold. A decision. If he was going down, he would go down fighting. Rick lifted his chin. "My name is Rick Holloway," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm the father of Claire Holloway. I believe one of your dancers, Celeste, is my daughter." The words hung in the air, thick and unyielding. For the briefest moment, something flickered across Reuben's face. Recognition. Fear. But just as quickly it vanished, replaced by an icy mask of control. Ah, Celeste, my favorite student, ever graceful, and those legs. Before anyone could process his words, Rick's anger surged like a tidal wave. With a guttural growl, he lunged forward. His fist met Reuben's jaw with a sickening crack, the force reverberating through his arm. The room went silent for a heartbeat, the impact ringing louder than anything that had come before it. Reuben staggered back, a look of pure shock crossing his face. "What did you do to her?" Rick shouted, years of pent-up grief and rage erupting in his voice. "What did you do to my daughter and the others?" The security guards surged forward, grabbing Rick by the arms. Their grips were bruising, but Rick barely noticed. His focus was locked on Reuben, whose lip now bore a thin trickle of blood. Reuben exhaled slowly, regaining his composure. When he spoke, his voice was deathly calm. "Didn't you hear how happy those girls were?" he said, straightening his suit. "Look around. This is their dream life. You never should have come here." His cold eyes raked over Rick with something between amusement and pity. "You're only setting yourself up for disappointment. You have nothing to offer them compared to what I can." Then, with a subtle nod to the guards, he added, "But you've made a big mistake. Take him to the basement." Rick thrashed against their hold, but they were too strong. They dragged him through the lavish corridors, his heels skidding against the polished floors. Despite his predicament, he couldn't help but notice the sheer opulence of his surroundings. Crystal chandeliers dripping from the ceiling, gold-framed paintings of ballet performances, thick carpets that muffled his struggles. A stark contrast to the violence of the moment. Then, just as they reached a heavy wooden door that presumably led to the basement, the air was split by the piercing wail of sirens. Everything stopped. The guards hesitated, grips tightening instinctively. Reuben's face paled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. His head snapped toward the entrance, where flashing blue and red lights cast frantic colors across the mansion's pristine walls. "Did you call the police?" he demanded, rounding on Rick. Rick, equally stunned, shook his head. Reuben's eyes darted wildly before he barked a sharp order to his men. "Forget him. We need to leave, now." The guards released Rick and rushed to follow Reuben, who strode toward what Rick assumed was the garage. But before they could reach it, the sound of car doors slamming and commanding voices filled the air. "This is the police. Everyone stay where you are, hands in the air." Relief crashed over Rick like a tidal wave. Stumbling forward, he pushed through the grand entrance, emerging into the golden afternoon sunlight. Several officers swarmed the property, weapons drawn. Reuben and his men had nowhere to go. And then, standing near one of the police cars watching the scene unfold, Rick saw a familiar face. Daniel. A sharp breath left Rick's lungs, an unexpected surge of emotion rising in his chest. He walked toward his brother, unsteady but determined. Daniel met him halfway, gripping his shoulder before pulling him into a firm embrace. "You're an idiot," he muttered, his voice thick with both reprimand and relief. Rick let out a shaky chuckle. "How did you know?" Daniel pulled back, giving him a wry smile. "I knew something was wrong when I got your voicemail. You gave me the address and then stopped answering my calls." He shook his head. "I called the police, gave them the information. Turns out this property is registered under the Kendricks." Rick exhaled, absorbing the weight of it all. "So this place, it must be kept for the ballet team." Daniel nodded grimly. Rick turned, his eyes following the officers as they secured handcuffs around Reuben and his security guards at the grand entrance of the mansion. The once powerful man, now just another suspect in custody, was led away from the lavish estate. Rick watched as the police radioed for additional backup. Moments later, the cruisers pulled away, carrying Reuben Kendrick and his men into the hands of justice. And yet, despite the victory, something still gnawed at Rick's gut. The battle wasn't over. His gaze lifted toward the mansion, toward the rooms where the dancers had been led away. He had come this far. He had found the place where Claire might be. But now, he had to save her. The Kendrick estate, once a picture of serenity and opulence, had transformed into a chaotic scene of flashing lights and urgent voices. Rick and Daniel stood side by side, watching as more police cars arrived, their sirens piercing the quiet afternoon air. From the grand doors again emerged a group of women. Some were maids, while others were the ballerinas, still clad in their delicate performance attire. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and fear as they huddled together, guided by police officers. Rick's gaze swept over them, his pulse quickening when he spotted the woman with the bow-adorned shoes, the one he was certain was Claire. The police brought the women to an area near their cars where an officer began to interview them. Rick and Dan approached cautiously, straining to hear the conversation. "This is our home," one of the women was saying, her voice trembling. "We've been living here since we were young." Another woman nodded in agreement. "This place is all we know. We don't have anywhere else." The police officer's brow furrowed as he asked, "Do you know who your families are?" "Your real homes?" The woman with the bow on her shoes, Celeste, spoke up, her voice clear despite the confusion in her eyes. "This is the only family we have, officers. Mr. Kendrick told us he rescued us one by one from bad places and adopted us. He gave us his home, even his family name, and said we should be proud to be his children." The other women nodded in agreement, some adding that it would be an honor if Kendrick had chosen any of them to spend the night with. The police officer looked increasingly troubled as he asked for clarification. Celeste continued, her voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "We believe Mr. Kendrick is the leader of God's dancing worshippers. He's training us to dance, and we're serving the Almighty God. He is a holy man, officers. You can't arrest him." Rick, Dan, and the police officers exchanged glances, the horrifying realization dawning on them all. These women had been thoroughly brainwashed. After a moment of stunned silence, Rick stepped forward, catching the eye of the interviewing officer. "May I speak with Celeste?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. The officer hesitated but then nodded. "Just for a moment. We'll need to continue this at the station." Rick approached the group, his eyes fixed on Celeste. Do you remember me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Celeste looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "No," she said confidently. "Who are you?" The pain of her words was like a physical blow to Rick. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "My name is Rick Holloway," he said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a worn photograph. "I believe you're my daughter. Look." He held out the photo, pointing to the ballet shoes worn by the smiling little girl in the blue tutu dress. "See the bows on the shoes? Just like yours." Celeste stared at the photo, her expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. I don't remember," she said softly. Rick felt his heart breaking all over again, but he pressed on. "Your childhood name, do you remember it?" Celeste shook her head, looking increasingly distressed. Rick, sensing her discomfort, quickly pulled out another photo from his wallet. This one showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Do you remember her?" Rick asked gently. "She was your mother." Celeste's eyes widened as she looked at the photo. I think so," she said slowly. "Yes, I remember her. She was my mum." Her brow furrowed as she continued. "But Reuben said she died in a car accident and he saved me." Rick shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Celeste. Your mother didn't die in a car accident. She passed away from cancer 7 years ago. We were both devastated when you went missing with your ballet class and coach." Celeste stared at the photograph, her eyes filling with tears as she struggled to reconcile these new revelations with the life she had known. The other dancers watched in stunned silence, their own certainties beginning to crumble. Before Rick could say more, a police officer stepped in. "We need to continue this at the station," he said gently but firmly. "We've radioed and invited all the parents who reported their children missing from that ballet group 31 years ago. Some are already on their way." Rick hesitated before giving the officer a small nod, reluctantly stepping back. He pressed the photograph into Celeste's hands, silently urging her to hold on to it. Then, with a heavy heart, he retreated, standing beside Daniel as they watched the women being carefully escorted into police vehicles. The weight of the moment settled over him. Though he had possibly found Claire, the joy was overshadowed by the stark reality of what she and the others had suffered. Years of manipulation, blind devotion, and stolen identities could not be undone in a single night. "Let's go," Rick said to Dan, his voice heavy with emotion. "We'll drive to the station." As they walked to Rick's car, he couldn't help but glance back at the mansion, a place that had been a home for these women for so many years. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the expansive grounds. The police car finally left the mansion, its sirens fading into the distance. All that remained was the quiet hum of the investigation team, working meticulously to gather evidence from the sprawling estate. Rick, still reeling from the whirlwind of events, took a deep breath and slid into the driver's seat. His hands were steady on the wheel as he followed the line of police cruisers, the flashing lights of 5 vehicles ahead of him cutting through the darkened streets. The drive to the station felt longer than it was supposed to. Rick's thoughts swirled in a haze of disbelief, anger, and an undeniable sense of urgency. What had they just uncovered? What had been hidden behind those gates for all these years? Finally, they arrived at the station. The parking lot was already filled with cars. Rick pulled into the parking lot, the car's tires crunching on the gravel. He turned off the engine but didn't immediately move to get out. Instead, he sat there for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady himself. Daniel, sensing his brother's need for a moment of calm, waited patiently in the passenger seat. "Dan, I never thought this day would actually come after all this time. I'm excited, but at the same time I'm terrified. It's like a small part of me doesn't even want to step through that door to learn the truth. It's strange, but if you know what I mean, you know." Daniel reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Rick's shoulder. "I know, Rick, but we'll face it together. One step at a time." With a nod, Rick opened the car door, the warm late afternoon air washing over him as he stepped out. The brothers made their way to the station entrance, the weight of the moment palpable between them. As they entered the station, Rick immediately sensed the thick, palpable tension in the air. The waiting room was crowded with a group of parents, all standing or pacing, their anxious anticipation hanging heavy. They looked just like him, nervous, hopeful, and desperate for answers. These were parents who had carried the unbearable weight of a missing child for over 3 decades, their pain etched into every tired glance, every restless movement, each one holding on to a fragile thread of hope. When Rick, Dan, and the officers escorting the group of ballerinas entered, the room fell into a heavy silence. Every eye turned toward them, and for a brief moment, Rick felt as though he were being scrutinized under a microscope. The police officers moved forward, raising their hands in a calming gesture to ease the tension in the room. "Please, everyone, remain calm," one of the officers said firmly, his voice cutting through the air. "We need to process some things first. These women are confused, and we have to follow procedure. Please wait until you're called." Rick nodded, grateful for the brief moment of clarity. He turned to Celeste, offering her a reassuring smile as the officer who had led them into the station gestured for them to follow him down the hallway. "Rick, I'll wait here," Dan said quietly, his hand resting on his brother's shoulder. "Take your time. You're not alone in this." With a final glance at his brother, Rick walked into the hallway where Detective Jend was waiting. The officer led Rick and Celeste into a stark interview room, the walls bare and cold. The hum of the overhead lights made the space feel even emptier. "Good evening, Mr. Holloway and Mrs." Detective Jend glanced at Celeste. "Mrs. Kendrick," Celeste replied, still holding on to the name. "Very well, please take a seat. First, Mr. Holloway, we believe you were the hero behind today's events, and I would like to express our gratitude to you. Before we begin, I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to get to the bottom of this situation." Rick nodded, still processing the whirlwind of events, but there was no time to dwell on it. He took his seat, his mind racing. Detective Jend continued, his tone shifting as he moved to more serious matters. "I'll cut to the chase, allow me," Detective Jend said, his voice firm but laced with the gravity of the situation. "First, I'd like to assure you that Mr. Kendrick's already been processed." He paused, his gaze narrowing as he continued. We've interviewed his bodyguards and staffs, and it's worse than we thought. Turns out, most of the staff here, the maids and the bodyguards, were also missing persons from long time ago, people from Reuben Kendrick's father's generation. Rick felt a chill run down his spine at these words. He glanced at Celeste, seeing his own shock reflected in her eyes. "Trafficking?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Children," the detective said grimly. "Young children, especially those around 4 years old and younger. They're easier to manipulate, easier to erase their memories, and replace them with what Kendrick wants them to believe. Reuben Kendrick has been brainwashing them for years." Rick gulped, fighting to maintain his composure. "I can understand the staff and bodyguards. They were kidnapping children for labor to secure their utmost loyalty. But why the ballet? Why target these girls?" Detective Jend exchanged a glance with Celeste before responding. "We're still piecing it together, but brainwashing and control seem to be the motive. That's why we need to hear it from them, the ballet dancers themselves, to understand the full picture. Miss Kendricks, will you help us understand what's going on here?" Celeste nodded, her gaze drifting down to her hands folded in her lap. Recognizing Celeste's fear, the detective's demeanor softened as he asked, "We were told this was the first time you've performed ballet in public. Where else have you and your team danced before, Miss Kendrick?" Celeste's eyes seemed to brighten as she began to speak, the memories spilling from her like a confession. "We only performed at private events. Events for rich people," she said softly, her voice tinged with reverence. "Reuben told us we were daughters of angels, with a higher level of ballet technique, and he was the leader of the angel worshippers, and our purpose was to dance beautifully for these high-status people, to serve them. He said no one else could dance like us. We were fulfilling our life's purpose, what we were created for. He marked every performance and how satisfied our guests were, spoke to God about it, and promised we'd be rewarded." The room was heavy with silence as Celeste continued, her words laced with a strange sense of pride. "We practiced all day, every day. Morning to night, we didn't leave the house, we never watched movies, and we knew nothing about the world outside. If we did watch anything, it was ballet, and Reuben would point out how we were better than the other dancers outside." Rick's chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. He had hoped that Claire had at least been able to live a good, happy life, but instead, he was confronted with the horrifying truth of her, and the other girls' exploitation. The weight of it hit him like a blow, and he struggled to keep his composure. The detective pressed on. "Did you ever receive any money from these rich people? From the people you served?" Celeste shook her head slowly. "No, but it wasn't about money. It was about serving Reuben, the worship leader, and God. That was our reward." Rick clenched his fists, the rage bubbling up inside him. Kendrick hadn't just used them. He had robbed them of their lives, their futures, all in the name of control. "Do you know anything about the coach, Claire's coach?" Rick asked, his voice strained. Detective Jen's expression hardened as he spoke. "The security guards have confessed that the coach wasn't part of the child kidnappings. However, he did try to help the girls escape. For that, they killed him. They disposed of his body in an industrial burner they have in the mansion's basement. We're still waiting for the investigation team to gather more information from the scene. That's where they've disposed of other bodies, bodies of traitors, dancers who grew too weak, too sick, or lost their beauty." Rick felt a shock of horror and guilt. For so long he had suspected the coach, and now he realized how wrong he had been. Celeste's eyes widened in disbelief, her breath catching as she whispered, "I never knew about that." Her voice was barely audible. "We were never allowed near the basement. But Mr. Kendrick was always so kind. He wouldn't do something like that to us. He loves each one of us." Detective Jen shook his head, his expression filled with sympathy. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Kendrick, I'm sorry to say, but those are the details we received from Kendrick's personal security guards. It's clear that Mr. Kendrick had been deceiving all of you, including your friends, with alarming ease. Now that you know the truth, it's crucial that you tell us everything you know about him. Your testimony, along with the other ballerinas, will ensure that Mr. Kendrick receives the punishment he deserves. He could face life imprisonment for this." Rick nodded, his thoughts still reeling, the weight of the truth pressing down on him harder than ever. Celeste stared in disbelief at the new information, her face a mirror of emotions. Rick watched as her expression shifted, first to horror, then to pain from the betrayal, followed by disbelief and denial. Finally, after a long while, the tears broke free, as if she had suddenly come to the painful realization of how much of her life had been consumed by this man. All the devotion, the adoration, now felt like nothing but ash and vain hope. Detective Jen noticed that Celeste was in no condition to continue testifying and nodded solemnly. He clasped his hands together, speaking slowly and with understanding. "I recognize the weight of all of this, and I won't push you any further right now, Ms. Kendrick. You've provided us with valuable information. If we have any follow-up questions, we'll reach out. And if there's anything you need to tell us when you're ready, don't hesitate to contact me. This is a major case, and we expect new leads to surface as we speak to more of the girls and their families." Rick nodded, feeling the weight of everything they had just uncovered settling into him. It was overwhelming, but there was still hope on the horizon. "Thank you," Rick said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I understand. We'll wait to hear from you." Detective Jen gave them a small, understanding nod before heading for the door. "Feel free to stay in here and take some time. We'll be calling in the next parents for their statements at another room. Take care of yourselves." As the door clicked shut behind him, silence filled the room. Rick turned to Celeste, who was once again holding the photograph of her mother and her as a child. Her fingers traced the edges of the picture softly, as if connecting with memories she wasn't sure she could trust. For a moment there was an awkward stillness. Celeste's face was filled with quiet contemplation, but Rick could see the sadness and confusion beneath her calm exterior. He cleared his throat gently, wanting to bridge the distance between them. "Those are your favorite childhood ballet shoes," Rick said gently, his gaze fixed on the photograph in her hands. "Your mum told me that Mr. Alvin, your coach, warned you countless times to take off the bow, but you always insisted on keeping it. You said you wanted to dance like a princess." Celeste stared at it for a long moment, her brow furrowed as if trying to dredge up a memory from deep within. Slowly, she spoke, her voice distant. "I have spotty memories of those shoes. They were important to me, I think." Her voice trailed off, the confusion evident in her words. Rick nodded, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his gallery. He held it out to her, showing another image. "If you look closely, you'll see your name written inside the sole. Claire. That was your name, the one your mum gave you. She was so adamant about it, saying Claire meant bright light." Celeste's eyes widened, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the phone. She studied the image with intense focus, her lips moving silently as she traced the name written inside the shoe. "Sometimes," Celeste whispered, her voice barely audible, "when I think of Mum, I almost feel like I can hear her calling me Claire, not Celeste. It's like a part of me remembers that. But it's fragmented, like fleeting glimpses of a dream that slip away." Rick's heart ached as he watched her struggle with her memories. "Reuben told you your name was Celeste, right?" he asked softly. Celeste nodded slowly, a profound sadness clouding her eyes. "I asked him a few times, a long time ago, why I sometimes felt like my name was Claire, like I could hear Mom's voice calling me that. You see, he was a very gentle man. He would visit our room every night, taking turns, and we'd share stories. He'd listen to everything we said. He didn't have anyone else. He was always alone, but he loved our company. He never forced anything on us, it just developed naturally, and we all loved him." Rick felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach at the thought of the man, imagining his face in the same room as his daughter, even though she was an adult now. "And what did he say when you asked him about your name?" he asked, his voice tight with the weight of the thought. "He said I was wrong, that my real name is Celeste, but I don't know anymore." Her voice cracked slightly, the weight of the confusion hanging over her like a storm cloud. Rick's thumb hovered over the screen as he scrolled again, pulling up another photo, this time of him and Celeste from one of his military leaves. It was a picture of a time that felt so distant now, but to Rick it was a reminder of the girl he once knew, the girl he was slowly getting back. "I'm sorry I didn't remember you at all," Celeste murmured, her eyes fixed on the screen. Rick shook his head, his expression softening. "You don't need to apologize. I was away serving in the military. and wasn't home much. This was from the times I was here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were always so full of life, Celeste. I never doubted you'd become something extraordinary. You've always had incredible talent." Celeste took the phone from him gently, her eyes filling with tears as she studied the photo. I want to know more about who I was," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I want to remember. Maybe if I go home I'll find more pieces of myself. I remember flashes of how our house used to look. It's just so fragmented." Rick nodded, his voice soft but firm. "We'll take it slow. You can come home with me, Celeste. I still keep your room just the way you left it. If you're comfortable with that, it's yours. You can stay as long as you need." Celeste looked at him, her gaze searching his face for sincerity. When she saw it, a flicker of relief washed over her eyes. I would like that. I think I want to try," she said softly. Then her eyes met his, and with a newfound determination she added, "And Mr. Holloway, please call me Claire from now on. I want to use the name my mom gave me." Rick nodded. "And you can call me Rick if you're comfortable." Claire nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips as she gently dabbed the tears from her eyes. She exhaled a long, steady breath, as if releasing the weight of a burden she had been carrying for far too long. Rick smiled, his heart swelling with pride and warmth. "You've grown into a beautiful woman, Claire, inside and out. I'm proud of you, prouder than you know. But I know this won't be easy. This healing, it's going to take time, but we'll do it together. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Claire nodded, her expression softening. She still had a long road ahead of her, and Rick knew there were many pieces of the past she would need to reclaim. But as he looked at her, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. There was a future, however uncertain, that they could build together. The room felt quieter now, the weight of their conversation lingering. But in the quiet, there was a sense of peace and a restoration, a shared understanding. They were in this together. And as the door to the room opened again, signaling the next part of their journey, Rick squeezed Claire's hand gently. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about healing, rebuilding, and learning to trust the future once more.